Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with today's arrest of former Prince Andrew in the UK on his 66th birthday, not for the rape of underage girls, but for sharing confidential trade details with Jeffrey Epstein when Andrew was Britain's special envoy for international trade. Joining us to discuss the contrast between the British arresting a member of the royal family and Trump's Consiglieres at the top of the Justice Department protecting the mob boss in the Oval Office is Toby Miller, Distinguished Professor in Media and Cultural Studies at the Instituto Tecnológico de Monterrey in Guadalajara, Mexico. His most recent books are Violence, The Persistence of Violence, Colombian Popular Culture, How Green is Your Smartphone, and his latest book, just out, is Global Sports Go Green, or Do They? Then, with Trump imposing a death sentence on our children, grandchildren, and the planet by killing off efforts so far to deal with climate change, making it more likely we'll soon meet the point of no return, we'll examine the possibility of environmental movements becoming more radical and speak with Thomas Zeitzoff, an associate professor in the School of Public Affairs at American University. His research focuses on political violence, social media, and political psychology, and his work has appeared in Science Advances, American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, International Organizations, and Political Psychology, among other journals. He's the author of Nasty Politics, The Logic of Insult, Threats, and Incitement, and his latest book, just out, we will discuss, is No Option But Sabotage, The Radical Environmental Movement and the Climate Crisis. And before we begin at the start of this new year, which will culminate in the fateful midterm elections in November, polls already indicate MAGA Republicans will lose the House and possibly the Senate. But we're up against a Trump-Miller presidency already drunk with power, and they will do anything to stay in power, having already demonstrated their contempt for the United States Constitution with Trump's January 6, 2001 coup attempt. They see over half of the country as their enemy and have a private army of loyal thugs ready to round up critics of the regime they label as communist lunatics. As Trump cowers, the media and his cronies buy up the mainstream press, Background Briefing will continue to expose this malevolent regime's fascistic machinations, providing a daily insight into the news as a massive coalition of people power is mobilized to bring about an end to this nightmare and usher in a new era of reform not seen since Nixon departed the presidency in disgrace. To help save America's 250-year-old democracy, we need all hands on deck, and you can make a tax-deductible donation to help us do our part at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org. And thank you. And joining us now is Toby Miller, a professor of cultural and media studies at the Instituto Tecnológico de Monterrey at its campus in Guadalajara, Mexico. His most recent books include Violence, The Persistence of Violence, Colombian Popular Culture, and How Green is Your Smartphone. And his latest book, just out, is Global Sports Go Green, or Do They? Welcome to Background Briefing, Toby Miller.
Thanks so much, Ian. Can I just quickly add that at a time of such incredible trauma, personal, collective, worldwide, the combination of expertise and lack of self-interest that your program provides is a lifeline for so many of us.
Oh, thank you. And you've obviously are back and forth to London as well. So what do you make of, obviously having a perspective from Mexico, what do you make of the arrest of the former Prince Andrew and the extent to which there's justice in the UK over the Epstein files, but here in the United States, Trump's consiglieres in the Justice Department at the top are basically preventing any of the really dangerous information to Trump from coming out. And we have no such justice here in this country. And I'm wondering whether what the Brits have just done in arresting the former Prince Andrew might spur things over here. What do you think?
Well, it's certainly a big deal, Ian. The last time a member of the so-called royal family was interviewed by the police was Princess Anne over treatment of animals. But the last time anybody was arrested was during the English Civil War, middle of the 17th century, which resulted in King Charles I having his head cut off. So this is something dramatic, and it is very, very uncommon and very encouraging. Very encouraging because it shows that the old forms of unearned respect for this disgraceful family no longer apply. And the fact that they're poorly educated, inarticulate, and incompetent is something that has gotten through to the British public, but also to the police. In terms of the implications for the United States, obviously there are elements of capture that the royal family has over the British establishment, particularly, for example, the police guys who go around the world guarding them, who often not only guard these people's bodies, but also guard their secrets, but also in terms of decisions made about them at a public policy level. But apart from that, it's clear that in this instance, public opinion has shifted to the point where the police are actually prepared to take action. In the United States, as we've seen, the Justice Department has been purged of competence and plagued with incompetence, and incompetence operating in the name of particular moneyed interests. So whether it's a real example, I'm not so sure.
So King Charles I lost his head in 1649, and the current King Charles III has basically said that we will let the law take its course in the investigation. So what do you think's happening there? If you say that the royal family are a bunch of uneducated incompetents, the head of the royal family, of course, is the older brother, and it does seem that he's cutting loose his younger brother, who I understand was Queen Elizabeth's favourite son.
All of that, I think, is true. The other thing that's very important to point out here is that in the case of the Epstein files, which have been absolutely crucial in this case, the impetus behind investigating Mountbatten Windsor is undoubtedly the revelations to do with the late Virginia Giuffre. But the actual charge, it seems, assuming he is charged following his arrest and the investigation of his current and former home, is to do with misconduct in public office. And that misconduct is not about sexual violence. It is about the fact that for over a decade, he was a trade envoy for the UK, during which time it is quite probable that he shared British business interests and economic secrets with Epstein. That as soon as he received information of value by people smarter, better educated than him, he passed them on to Epstein where they could be of value. And this is not dissimilar to what it is said Peter Mandelson, the previous disgraced British ambassador to Washington, was doing. So this is impelled by all the scandals of sexual violence surrounding the criminality of Epstein, but it is actually off to one side, and it's to do with the murky intersection, Ian, between sex and business. And that is the sort of connection that the royal family doesn't want to be seen to endorse or have any closer to it than is already the case. But there are undoubtedly further revelations to come. I don't know what they are. And when they come out, they could affect the standing of the royal family in Britain and abroad.
But is there more or less impunity and immunity in the UK amongst the elite than there is here in the United States? Because what most people, both on the left and the right in this country, understand about the Epstein files and why people are upset about it is that it shows that there's a whole class of people, the Epstein class, and they can get away with pedophilia and the most horrible crimes because of their wealth. And much of the revelations in these files indicate an attitude of absolute arrogance and impunity.
Well, I think that applies to ruling classes everywhere. But in terms of what's going on in Britain at the moment, one can say to its relative credit that the current government under Keir Starmer, for all its foibles and failures and its lickspittle attitude to the Trump administration, is actually allowing legal processes to take their course, as is the monarchy. That's all great, and that's a definite improvement on what we've seen in the United States. And this is partly because the government itself is shamed by the revelations about Peter Mandelson, as I said, its previous ambassador there. And it's also impelled by the fact that Mountbatten Windsor had a terrible reputation for a very long time, and on two fronts. He was known as Randy Andy, not very affectionately, and was known for appalling conduct in public with women, but was also known as someone who spent vast amounts of taxpayers' money all the time during his grandiose private jet-flown world trips as trade envoy. So he was always already, Ian, in a weak spot, and Starmer is in a strong spot at this point in standing up for due process. We don't have anybody in power in the United States standing up for due process.
Well, indeed, and you mentioned Mandelson, Lord Mandelson. He just got kicked out of the House of Lords. He was the U.S. ambassador. He was the UK ambassador to the U.S., and he was giving Epstein top secret information about British government's trade and economic policies, etc., to Epstein, but also giving Epstein advice how to circumvent British law.
Well, and this was at a particularly crucial moment that most of your listeners will remember, and not with pleasure, namely the global financial crisis that began in our mutually beloved California, 2008, when Mandelson was working closely with the then British Prime Minister Gordon Brown, who convened a worldwide summit meeting of leaders of wealthy countries in order to find a means of getting a bailout for the capitalist economies in those states, with immensely complicated, confidential, commercial in confidence information being shared. For example, the fact that the Royal Bank of Scotland was about to fail, and so it needed to be taken over by the British taxpayer. And the second that Brown would get formal updates about this, along with Alistair Darling, who was then the Chancellor, which is like Secretary of the Treasury, Mandelson would send these off in the room via email or other form of communication to Epstein, with all sorts of implications what Epstein could do in terms of money management, things like betting for or against pound sterling, the British currency. So this is a very, very serious matter, and if proven, easier to pin on him in terms of legal proceedings, which would involve potentially substantial jail time, than would be the case with the misconduct in public office case with Mountbatten Windsor, where there isn't a lot of case law, there are lots of defences that allow you to get out of it, and even if he is charged, and that's the only charge, he may be able to not survive in terms of his reputation, but survive in terms of being, in inverted commas, a free man.
So what do you think is the attitude to, or the understanding of the British public, and also, since you're also in Mexico, the Mexican public? They must know about immunity and impunity from the 70 plus years of pre-rule, where a group of corrupt oligarchs ran the country and created this unequal system that is slowly being changed, but obviously not fast enough. And of course, here in the United States, oligarchy is on the march and democracy is in retreat. But we have a criminal syndicate, in effect, running this country. You've got the Godfather in the Oval Office, who is a wannabe mob boss and is behaving like a mob boss and is thoroughly corrupt and contemptuous of the law and has always been one step ahead of the sheriff. And now he's appointed his Consiglieres as the top two people in the Department of Justice, Bondi and Blanche. And apparently, even though 3 million files have been released, there's another 3 million that haven't been released. Some of the files that haven't been released are what the FBI field notes call 302s, people that get interviewed by FBI agents in the field are debriefed, and it's all handwritten. Apparently, these files include a bunch of young women in their early teens, one of whom claims to have been raped by Donald Trump. That 302 apparently has disappeared, because the first thing that Bondi and Trump did was have the FBI scrub these files. So in terms of the Epstein files, we don't know what the baseline is. We don't know what happened to the 3 million files that haven't been shown, or whether in fact they still exist.
Well, in terms of impunity, Ian, of course, the Supreme Court in the United States has essentially granted Trump that when it comes to anything done during his time in office. Here in Mexico, impunity is one of the big words. And it's one of the big words used to describe not only the past, but the present. And this is because, and I'm here in Guadalajara in one of the centers of this, narco crime, narcotraficante, is everywhere. And it's not everywhere just in terms of cocaine and other drugs. It's there in terms of the avocado business, the lime business, and in fact, the industry for pharmaceuticals. And more than that, in many cases, the mostly men involved in this at senior levels and often at junior levels may be known to break the law, but they may also be the people who are meant to be upholding the law, whether that be in the form of officials who are on the street in police uniform or in military uniform, or that be in the form of judicial appointees. So whilst things potentially are somewhat improving in terms of the oligarchically based inequality in Mexican society, economically, socially, culturally, when it comes to impunity, that's a much, much bigger task and an incredibly complex one. And it is fascinating to me that the current administration in the United States, at the same time as it is routinely berating Mexico, is actually moving closer and closer and ever closer to exactly that kind of cross-governmental impunity.
So is, though, the current heading in the opposite direction in the UK?
Well, that's an interesting one. The Metropolitan Police, which is based in London and is the biggest police force and most influential one in the country, is not actually the police force that's just arrested today Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. That's the Thames and Valley Police Force, a much smaller outfit, but relevant to where he's been living. The Metropolitan Police Force is conventionally and corrosively subject to scandal because of all kinds of corruption, sexual, monetary, violent, and so on, but at nothing like the level of the Mexican authorities in the past and in the present, and with much more successful media exposure now that journalists have taken more of a distance from the police than they used to have. And the judiciary, by and large, really is independent of that kind of graft and corruption. So, as I say, I think it'll be very different, very difficult indeed to get Mountbatten Windsor on a charge of misconduct in public office that will stick through the courts. But that's because it's a very complicated judicial matter. When it comes to Mandelson, I think it may be much, much easier. So there isn't the same impunity in Britain that we have in the United States, that we have in Mexico, but the judicial system is more trustworthy.
But what does it do to the class system, which is the sort of, the DNA of British culture, really? You've got this character, former Prince Andrew, whose decline and fall began when he arrogantly went on the BBC to defend himself against the initial charges coming from Virginia Giuffre about his involvement with Epstein and the young women like Virginia, and the pictures, of course, of him with her and with a beaming Ghislaine Maxwell in the same shot. It was his arrogance, I thought, that actually brought him down, his sense of immunity and impunity as being a royal.
No, that's absolutely true. And folks may well have seen that or could see that in the dramatizations that have been made by notable platforms, as well as the original interview. But The fact is that whilst the British class structure continues to be immensely powerful and incarnate in the royal family and in the House of Lords, the unelected upper house of democracy at the national level, there have been changes. There is a lot of what the British like to call new money. And a lot of the new money over the last 40 or 50 years comes from people who did not go to exclusive schools, do not have accents like mine, known as received pronunciation, and are unruly, unpleasant, nasty capitalists who are looked down upon by the traditional elite. So there's a fractured ruling class there, Ian, of a kind that there is between old and new money in New York, Chicago, San Francisco. In addition to which, the political class has changed. If we go back to when you arrived in London as a young reporter, then we would see then very, very few people from across British society represented in politics. Now there are many more women and men of working class or lower middle class backgrounds. And when it comes to the media, for example, the BBC, again, it used to be the case that only voices like mine, male and from the ruling elite's language groups, were allowed on air. Now you get lots of, in inverted commas, regional accents and cross-class ones. So it's still there. It's still the case that class matters. But that's also true in the United States. It's just that it's often hidden by race.
Well, I had heard, and I don't know whether this is true, that young Brits, it's cool to have a kind of a Cockney accent as opposed to a posh accent.
Well, this goes back to the 80s and 90s when the Cockney accent, the one supposedly of people born within the sound of Bow Bells, the one that Stanley Holloway has in My Fair Lady, that Audrey Hepburn starts out with in My Fair Lady, if people remember that film, was picked up by people from the sorts of schools that I went to and came to be known as a Mockney accent, not Cockney, but Mockney. In other words, one adopted in order to appear as though you were one of the people, because there was a certain coolness to the proletariat. That, however, does not apply to other regional accents that you get, for example, in the Southwest, the Northeast, the Northwest, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. But yes, it's been there. But all of that said, it remains the case that your best bet for getting ahead, for example, in the military, but also in corporations, is if you went to Oxford or Cambridge or Imperial, amongst the top universities. And your best chance of getting into those places is if you're one of the 7% of the population that went to fee-paying elite schools. So it's still there. I don't want to deny that. I just want to say that there are shifting eddies that are complicated, and in particular surrounding those within the ruling class who clearly do not qualify through any sense of either merit or hard work, namely the royal family.
But there's a very fundamental difference between the United States and the UK in terms of people in the military, the intelligence, and in the government, etc. In the US, and Trump himself put his hand on the Bible, which he's obviously never read, saying that you pledge allegiance to the Constitution of the United States. And in the UK, you pledge allegiance to the head of state, which is the Queen, right? Or now the King. So does that mean that the military, they are loyal to the royal family as opposed to the country?
They are loyal to the country as incarnate in the body of the monarch. And this is obviously a very, very serious problem, in particular when there is no constitutional document to go to in order to defend the democratic rights of the people against injurious conduct by a centralizing executive of a kind that we do have in the United States for all the foibles of the way in which the Constitution is preserved and interpreted. So the British Constitution is famously unwritten, though there are various documents from centuries ago that are taken in some sense to embody it. So there is no absolute entity to go to and say, aha, well, look at the Fifth Amendment, look at the First Amendment, look at this clause. You can't do that. And that, of course, means that a lot even more is in the hands of interpretation by the judiciary than is the case in the United States. The other thing, of course, that's interesting about this is that you mentioned the Bible in the case of the swearing into office of the president. In the British case, since the 16th century, the monarch has had the title of DF, which stands for Defender of the Faith, which ironically, just around the time of the Reformation, was granted by the Catholic Church to the then monarch, Henry VIII, and continues. And of course, unlike in the United States, Britain has an official religion, the Church of England, which is Protestant, akin to the Episcopalians in the United States. But funnily enough, having an official religion doesn't mean dominance by religion in politics. It's barely relevant. And Catholicism, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism all have their place in a fairly reasoned and reasonable way, despite the maniacal and vicious interpretations by the Vice President and President of the United States today. So the funny thing is, there's nothing protecting freedom of worship per the United States. There is an official religion, unlike the United States, but the pervasive and corrosive influence of religion in politics in the US doesn't apply.
So just in closing, in the last minute, Toby, do you think that these horrible pedophiles that were abusing these young girls, including the current president of the United States, will they ever be brought to justice?
I doubt that people at the very top of US society will be. And when we say brought to justice, one thing is, of course, to be arrested and to be charged, another is to be convicted. On all three levels, lots of them will get off scot-free. Some of them may be arrested, may be charged, but they've mostly got enough money to get away with just about.
Well, Toby Miller, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Toby Miller, who is a professor of cultural and media studies at the Instituto Tecnológico de Monterrey's campus in Guadalajara, Mexico. His most recent books are Violence, The Persistence of Violence, Colombian Popular Culture, and How Green is Your Smartphone. And his latest book, just out, is Global Sports Go Green, or Do They? We're going to take a brief station break, back examining the possibility of environmental movements becoming more radical since Trump has imposed a death sentence on our children, grandchildren, and the planet by killing off efforts so far to deal with climate change.
Oh, who does he think he is?
I'm your king.
Well, I didn't vote for you.
You don't vote for kings.
Well, how'd you become king then?
The Lady of the Lake, her arm clad in the purest shimmering samite, held aloft Excalibur from the bosom of the water, signifying by divine providence that I, Arthur, was to carry Excalibur. That is why I'm your king.
Listen, strange women lying in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government. Supreme executive power derives from a mandate from the masses, not from some farcical aquatic ceremony. Be quiet! Oh, but you can't expect to wield supreme executive power just because some watery tart threw a sword at you. Shut up! I mean, if I went round saying I was an emperor, just because some moistened bint had lobbed a scimitar at me, they'd put me away. Shut up! Will you shut up? Ah, now we see the violence inherent in the system. Shut up! Oh, come and see the violence inherent in the...
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Thomas Zeitzoff, who is an associate professor in the School of Public Affairs at American University. His research focuses on political violence, social media, and political psychology, and his work has appeared in Science Advances, American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, International Organization, Political Psychology, among other journals. And he's the author of Nasty Politics, The Logic of Insults, Threats, and Incitement. And his latest book, just out, is No Option But Sabotage, The Radical Environmental Movement and the Climate Crisis. Welcome to Background Briefing, Thomas Zeitzoff.
Pleased to be here. Thanks for having me, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And yesterday, the FBI visited members of the environmental group Extinction Rebellion two special agents from the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force visited members of the Extinction Rebellion in New York City chapter yesterday at their residence 200 miles outside of New York City. And obviously I want to talk to you further about your book, but your book makes it clear that this has always been a top priority of the FBI, is to go after environmental activists. Why are they doing that? Are they literally working for big oil and the fossil fuel companies?
So this is a great question. I think at like a fundamental level, we have to go back to Trump's kind of what happened in September and then again in December. So in September, Trump signed an executive order declaring Antifa as a domestic terror organization. But unlike foreign terrorist organizations, there is no domestic formal terrorist designation. And then he released his national security presidential memorandum, number 7. It basically laid out his administration's view that there's like a shadowy network of left-wing Antifa-affiliated terrorists, but also crucially nonprofits seeking to disrupt and overthrow the U.S. democracy. There's not, as I'm sure you're probably aware, but others, this is, for folks who study left-wing movements, this is not true. But I think one of the things that became clear, and I remember having an interview shortly after Trump was elected with a radical environmental activist in the Pacific Northwest, who's also a former veteran. And he basically said after Trump was elected, he goes, they're going to make Antifa the boogeyman. And he's kind of proven right. And so I think what's interesting about this investigation, and I think it also dovetails to what we see with the administration labeling ICE protesters and legal observers as terrorists, is that the government has always kind of gone after left-wing radical environmental groups, in the early 2000s, which I'm sure we're going to talk about during a period activists called the Green Scare, but that was for setting arsons, right? And now the sort of threshold for calling somebody a terrorist is you engage in protected speech or observations of law enforcement officials, right? It's not even property destruction. So the threshold for what the government considers terrorism has been lowered. And I think that's concerning to a lot of academics such as myself who've studied this, but also people more generally concerned about civil liberties in our country.
Well, the environmental group Extinction Rebellion's website says, quote, that they are a decentralized, international, and politically nonpartisan movement using nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience to persuade governments to act justly. And of course, the activist Greta Thunberg has been affiliated with them. So let's then talk about your book in the broadest, going back in the history that you bring to the table. Of course, it's worth noting that the cover of your book is a spanner or a monkey wrench, and that definitely has echoes of the monkey wrench gang, right? Early environmental activists.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of really interesting points here. The first is that there's a long history of conservation and environmentalism within the U.S. It goes, go back to Teddy Roosevelt, an early conservationist. And something that was kind of surprising to me is that a lot of, I talk quite a bit about this sort of formative group, the Earth First, which formed in 1980, and it was founded by sort of disaffected conservationists who were upset with kind of the mainstream environmental policies, and they advocated civil disobedience, but also, as you point out, taking a nod from Ed Abbey's book, The Monkey Wrench Gang, about a group of kind of misfits who go across the Pacific the West Coast, blocking development. What the monkey wrenching was this idea that you could like pull up survey stakes, maybe do a little light sabotage, put sugar in bulldozers to stop development. And this even grew into sort of the tree spiking controversy in the 80s and 90s, where activists to prevent clear cuts of forests would put metal or ceramic spikes into trees to prevent them being logged, because if you logged a tree and tried to mill it that had a tree spike in it, it could be pretty terrible both for the mill or even for the lumber worker doing it. And so the one thing that was kind of surprising to me is that some of these early activists were very, conservative in many ways, right? So there's Dave Foreman, who's one of the founders of Earth First, he was a fan of Nixon, and he was a self-proclaimed redneck for wilderness. And so I think that was kind of one of the really interesting things about doing the research, is that when we think of people who are environmental, we tend to think they drive a Prius, or they have a sign in their yard that says, "In this house, we believe in science." And it's very kind of liberal or left-wing coded, and that has not always been the case.
So at the present moment, though, what Trump has just done through, or Lee Zeldin, the head of the EPA, have done to take away the underpinning of all environmental efforts to deal with global warming is, in fact, I think, without getting into hyperbole, a declaration of a death sentence on our children and grandchildren. So what are we to do? And we are faced with unbelievable misanthrope in the Oval Office. Not only is a criminal, but he's a hateful, horrible person who wants to kill our kids and grandkids. What do we do about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the dilemma, in the sense that environmental activists and other folks are trying to figure out is, on one hand, right, as you laid out, is the Trump administration, it was kind of telegraphed from the beginning, but I think it's even in some ways been worse than a lot of activists feared, is they've gutted the EPA, they've blocked all sorts of rulings on fossil fuels, they've pulled out of all sorts of climate agreements, they've tried to gut climate change research, they've opened up federal lands to drilling and mining, and they've rolled back automotive standards, and they've blocked renewable energy. So it's kind of like this really awful worst case scenario. And I think the irony is that the reason Earth First was created in the first place was this rollback of environmental protections, particularly on federal land. So in some sense, we're at a point where the grievance, or the kind of lack of any kind of policy on climate change, even as the Earth continues to warm and the effects become more apparent and worse, and we have wildfires, smoke, choking much of the country during the summer, that we're doing even less. So there is this kind of pressure, right, that's building among activists. But then there's also, I think, this concern, and I think it's a big concern, is that the ability, right, like we were talking about at the beginning, is that it's not just, property destruction is criminalized, not just civil disobedience, but even things that are protected speech and constitutionally protected protests are now enough to maybe get you labeled as a terrorist. So there's increased repression going along with these rollback of environmental policy. And I think a lot of activists who I interviewed and I continue to be in touch with, right, is there's a big debate. What do we do, right? The U.S. is having, if you are somebody like myself who cares about democracy, you're very concerned about the trajectory that the Trump administration has put the U.S. on, with rolling back all sorts of, things that we thought only happened in other countries, free and fair elections. All these are under threat. And also the environment is under threat. And so what was interesting, and what I've kind of seen happen is I've talked to activists who have been involved in the climate movement, the environmental movement, is a lot of them are shifting into doing pro-democracy work, and also protesting against ICE and organizing against ICE. And the view that's kind of come around is that, should we do environmental and climate work, or should we focus on pro-democracy stuff? And the answer they've said is we have to do both, because we can't have an environmental movement if we're not a democracy anymore.
But I think what the demonstrators and the protesters, the citizens of Minneapolis, St. Paul, they showed how effective nonviolent action can be, even though they were met with hideous violence and murder, in the case of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, by the federal government. They literally murdered before our eyes. It's just hideous what happened. But this creative way they used whistles and organized to frustrate ICE's efforts is really admirable. And I think in many ways it's a sea change for the American left and the Democratic Party to recognize that the American citizens, and many of them are not on the left, they're centrists and conservatives, simply don't want the government thugs are going after American citizens, not to mention non-citizens who are being treated brutally and unfairly and being warehoused and exploited and deliberately terrorized into submission. That's the whole point of these warehousing all these people, is to make life so miserable for them that they'll give up their rights and accept deportation. So this is a misanthropic government that is so malevolent, it's pretty obvious. But the point is surely, Thomas, that non-violent reactions to a violent and fascistic government is the way to go, right? The FBI is ready to pounce on anybody that even tinkers with the notion of violence.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and something that I found in kind of interviewing activists, both former and current activists, and people who were involved in some of the kind of current protests, is I think the activists that I interviewed do not have any problems with, kind of some of them. I would say there's a spectrum, but some of the kind of more radical activists don't have a problem with using property destruction. If they think it's going to help them. And I think they've come to the view that it's not, right? And so somebody who, was pretty lefty and anarchist said, they were actually quite heartened by the discipline of activists in Minneapolis, right? And confronting federal immigration officers while also doing what they called avoiding the sort of, as they would say, smashy actions, like breaking windows, burning cars, that would actually garner more repression. And others pointed at like kind of this widespread like school to school walkouts that have happened. And I think, as you pointed out, right, and I think this has been some of the kind of heartening things that have come out of Minneapolis and some of these other places. And I think, again, it's important to have some optimism, is that ordinary people who, as you would say, would not, you wouldn't call super political, are becoming politicized in socializing, realizing that, hey, if we want to keep this country democracy, we need to organize, we need to do it smartly, we need to figure out ways to use strategic nonviolence to call attention to a lot of the abuses that are happening under the current Trump administration. And I think that strategically it's smart. I also think in some ways, like the terrorism label that the government has been very eager to tar against activists has backfired in a lot of ways, right? And like when you're calling Alex Preddy or Renee Good, you're calling them domestic terrorists, like before even anything has been released, it kind of makes the term itself absurd in a lot of ways. So in some sense, in their eagerness, the Trump administration to engage in repression, right, I think they fumbled in many of ways, and there's been a backlash, and people have realized that, hey, there's actually, this isn't just, deporting criminals, this is going after people in communities, and your friends, your family, your neighbors. And I think that's been something that's definitely politicized people. And I think that people, even from the more radical fringes in the movement, recognize that the movement, to be successful, this pro-democracy movement needs to be broad, and it also needs to maintain its kind of strategic nonviolence, especially in the face of some of the repression.
But there's also a history on the other side, if you will, of corporate cops like the Pinkertons, who back in the early protests against the plutocrats in the Gilded Age, against the Rockefellers, for example, tremendous violence was meted out against union protesters, right? And more recently, the environmentalists who were protesting the pipelines from Canada through the United States, the oil pipelines, they were met by sort of corporate vigilante types, thugs, were they not?
Yeah, I mean, so this is one of the things that was kind of fascinating, is that, again, I think we have a sort of, our view of the environmental and conservation movement in the US is that, oh, it was a bunch of hippies and lefties. And there's definitely, people that came from the new left and hippies in the movement, but there's also, again, a strong ethos among hunters, among people who live in rural areas who do not want, for very good reasons, their communities to be polluted, their forests to be chopped down and completely clear cut, that there is this kind of local sort of conservationist ethos. And as you said, I think one of the things that's also been true is, whether it be the Dakota Access Pipeline protests or some of the timber wars that happened in the Pacific Northwest in the 80s and 90s, part of the reason I think that some of the radical environmentalists who, were engaged in civil disobedience, like tree sitting or blocking timber roads, were met with quite a bit of violence and threats, is because they were basically hurting the bottom line of companies that were doing things that they probably shouldn't. And that's, I think, but one of the concerning parts, I think, that's happened is that, I don't know if maybe you guys in your audience is aware, but one of the big things that a lot of radical environmentalists, or even just mainstream environmental activists, have been watched was the Energy Transfer's lawsuit against Greenpeace over Dakota Access Pipeline protests. and the judgment that Energy Transfers, the major oil and gas company that sponsored the pipeline, won against Greenpeace. It's over $700 million. It's enough to bankrupt Greenpeace USA. And I think the concern that activists, even like, again, in sort of mainstream climate NGOs worry is they see what happens with Extinction Rebellion. They saw what happened with Greenpeace, and the money and the donations, like, hey, do you want to donate to an NGO that's a climate NGO with the risk that you may be tarred of like supporting terrorist organizations for groups that engage in nonviolent civil disobedience? So again, I think there's the threat in the streets, but then there's also kind of the legal lawfare threat that's being used. And again, this goes back to the Trump administration declaring Antifa a terrorist organization, but also saying that it's supported by this vast, shadowy left-wing group of nonprofit organizations, and George Soros and the Open Society Foundation are kind of at the center of it. It's a fever dream, but it's also a pretext to engage in these kinds of legal lawfare tactics that are designed as well to hamstring movements that are seeking to protect the environment and protect our democracy.
So, Thomas, let me just quickly go through the chapters of your book, which give our audience a sense of the scope of the research that you've done in your new book, No Option But Sabotage: The Radical Environmental Movement and the Climate Crisis. Chapter 1, Racist Origins of the Radical Environmental Movement, Concerns over Overpopulation, The Birth of Earth First, 1930s to 1980s. Chapter 2, Schisms Within Earth First and the Radical Environmental Movement, 1980s to 1990s. Chapter 3, Punk Animal Rights and Radical Environmental Movements, 1970s to 1990s. Chapter 4, Ted Kaczynski and the Rise of the Earth Liberation Front, 1995 to 2000. Chapter 5, Repression and Operation Backfire, 2001 to 2010. Chapter 6, Post-Repression Emergence of Climate Justice Movement, Dakota Pipeline Fights, Stop City, 2010 to 2024. Chapter 7, Eco-Fascism, 2010 to the present. Chapter 8, Throwing Soup, Defacing Paintings, Disrupting Events, 2020 to the present. Chapter 9, Where the Movement Goes From Here, Present Future. So let's start with that one at the end, Chapter 9, because obviously covering Trump, you deliver the daily dose of doom, and I don't want to reinforce despair. There's so much going wrong because of these malicious, horrible people that are destroying America and the world in the White House and in the cabinet. So tell us about the last chapter and what can be done, because obviously people have got to stand up for Mother Earth. There's no choice now, because the attack has, the battle lines have been drawn. The attack is on. We're on the defensive. Trump and the polluters have got the game sewn up, and they're determined to roll back the clock to the point where we'll reach the point of no return.
Yeah. So I think this is, I'm going to play the role, and I actually do believe it is like a cautious optimist, right? In the sense that I think there are, when Trump was elected, I think there were, I laid out like a couple different ways that we could have gone, right? There could have been repression and a movement, broadly speaking, the environmental movement is one of movements that just dies. We could have like radicalization, that people within the movement say there's nothing left to lose, and they start carrying out violent attacks, and it's of questionable tactical success, but also leads to even more repression. I think the most unlikely scenario is that we continue on like as the status quo, because the status quo has been ruptured. But I think we're in a point right now where, again, that movements, whether they be, kind of people, the anti-ICE movement, the No Kings rallies, there's this broad sort of coalition of folks that are coalescing, as I would say, as like a broad pro-democracy protest. And I think one of the things that I take heart in, again, is that, there are a lot of things that you can say about the Trump administration and their policies, right? They're very scary. They have, definitely targeted, they have authoritarian tendencies, is very clear, and they've taken authoritarian maneuvers, but they're not patient, right? They're not patient like Orban in Hungary. They're not patient like Erdogan in Turkey to consolidate, right, the authoritarian rule. And in some sense, they've kind of repressed everybody, or trying to repress everything. And in doing so, I think they've overplayed their hand. And he is very unpopular. And I think that I'm like less concerned about the long-term trajectory of US democracy, which again, I think is tied up with where we will be on the climate. Short term, though, again, there's a lot of stuff on the table, the saber rattling with Iran, right? All this talk about the SAVE Act and what they want to do with elections, some of which they are going to try and claim they can do, and they'll be very difficult for them not to do, or to actually, successfully carry out some of the things they want to do. So I think, they're both, scary and ruthless in a lot of ways, but they don't have the patience to sort of build the thing that I think a lot of political scientists like myself feared, which was like, an authoritarian, stable one-party rule. Again, but that doesn't mean that there aren't, space for a lot of bad things. So I think the optimistic take too is that a lot of people have become, not radicalized, but I would say politically aware of the issues and threats facing our democracy. And it's not just environmental activists, but it's ordinary people like climate scientists, doctors, engineers, like who are getting into politics. And so I take heart with that. Like, I don't think anything is a foregone conclusion. Now, on the environment, there's a lot that they're doing, and that's really terrible at the US perspective, right? Especially scrapping renewables, right? Also trying to make, the US automotive industry like regressive, and we're going to be like the last country in the world they want with like gasoline cars. But the tide is turning. I mean, the economics of renewable energy, of electric cars, it's coming, and all they're trying to do, I think is going to delay it a little bit. And it's sad that, the US could be at the leader of this, and instead we're going to be maybe in the back. But I think that's one of my optimistic takes on this. I think, though, the other thing too that I do wonder about, and it's something I talk about in the book a little bit, is again, like the environmental movement is there's nothing inherently, left wing about, nature, protecting the environment. And I do wonder if at some point when the climate change really becomes salient and unable for people on the right to sort of deny that it's happening, what that will look like. And I think that's something to also keep in mind, because one of the things that I talk about in my book as well that's was fascinating, and know as much as it was, is that Stephen Miller and the current groups of like Center for Immigration Studies, Foundations of Americans for Immigration Reform, those are part of this network of groups founded by John Tanton, who was a member of the Sierra Club, part of Zero Population Growth, and he was a very prominent environmentalist and also a xenophobe, anti-immigration activist, and racist who helped launch this modern anti-immigration movement. So the echoes of the environmental movement are there, and I do wonder about where we might be headed, especially when for people on the right, it's harder for them to deny climate change.
So just in the last minute, though, we're offering up your new book, Thomas Zeitzoff, No Option But Sabotage the Radical Environmental Movement and the Climate Crisis, in support of Background Briefing and KPFK in Los Angeles and across Southern California, and KPFA in San Francisco across the Bay Area. We wanted to ask you here in the last minute what you might tell our audience in terms of why it is important to get this book, because clearly people know that they are under assault from Trump and his administration and the billionaire backers, and they know that he's destroyed what little progress has been made to save the world from global warming. So we can't sit on our hands, but also we can't get involved in violent responses. So how do we thread the needle?
It's a great question, and I think it's something that I interviewed over 100 current and former activists, and one of the things that sort of came across in the interviews, and I try to get across in the book, is that, and why I think the story of the radical environmental movement is one that's of interest not just to environmentalists but people more broadly, is that this is a movement that has tried to figure out what tactics do we need to make people care about the environment, to protect wilderness, right? To protect our planet from climate change. And a lot of these, folks in the movement, and they've thought really hard and long, and they've experimented, is a diversity of a tactics approach. Maybe we need somebody who's willing to engage in civil disobedience or tree sitting, right, to get the name out there, but we're also going to sue people at the same time. I mean, I think one of the most fascinating things is Earth First, which many people, again, consider the birth, the sort of the founder of the U.S. radical environmental movement. At the same time, they were engaging in tree sits and civil disobedience in Oregon in the 1980s. They were also doing polling to find out how, what were people's attitudes on clear cutting and logging. And they found that their campaigns actually made in Oregon, like a solid timber state, moved people 30 points more in favor of protection of these old growth forests. And so I think this idea that we need to experiment, there needs to be a diversity of tactics, but also, as I talk about in the book, right, how do groups and movements deal with the threat of repression? And that was something else that came across in my book. And I think it was interesting is that I've done research in a lot of different spots all over the world, and far and away, the kind of most security conscious people I've interviewed have been radical environmental activists. And that's part of the legacy of repression. And I think a lot of activists are learning that, as you led with the story about Extinction Rebellion when we started talking today. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, I thank you for joining us, and I recommend your book to our audience. Obviously, No Option But Sabotage: The Radical Environmental Movement and the Climate Crisis. Thanks again, Thomas.
Thank you so much, Ian. Really appreciate being here.
And again, I've been speaking with Thomas Zeitzoff, who's an associate professor in the School of Public Affairs at American University. His research focuses on political violence, social media, and political psychology, and his work has appeared in Science Advances, American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, International Organization, and Political Psychology, among other journals. And he's the author of Nasty Politics: The Logic of Insults, Threats, and Incitement. And his latest book, just out, is No Option But Sabotage: The Radical Environmental Movement and the Climate Crisis. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews searchable by topic and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.